everyone, it's Stephanie from Little Cookie Co. I'm back with another great set, super fun and easy to make, and beautiful colors just in time for spring. So here I've got some colors that I've chosen, and I made them in both consistencies, my outline and my flood icing as well. If you need help on that, I've linked my royal icing video where I show you that down below in the description of the video. So let's start with our first cookie. Here we have our bunny cookie. Now I'm going to start with my outline consistency. This is a thicker one, and I call this my outline consistency. And so every time there's sort of a point or an area where I have like a sharp curve, I will touch down my bag, and any area that's a smooth curve, I will lift up my bag. That way I'll get a nice straight line. If you're trying to pipe right onto the cookie and not lift up your bag, you won't get really that nice, smooth, straight line. Now, if you notice my cookie looks a little funny, it doesn't look nice and smooth up top, and that's totally fine. You won't notice any of this once we fled. This was frozen dough that I had that I've re-rolled several times. So sometimes when you freeze and unfreeze dough, or the tops get a little bit dry before you put them in the oven, this can happen and it just cracks a little bit. But no one will know the difference, and it really doesn't affect the cookie that much. So here I'm just going with my flood consistency, and so I'm trying to work a little bit fast because we're going to do a wet on wet technique. And so what I want to do is pipe right after I finish my flood layer here. So what I want to do is pipe with my other flood consistencies, and this way the icing kind of melts into the base layer. So it's not sitting on top of the layer, it's just going to kind of go inside. So here I'm not going to wait for my icing to dry and go right away with my yellow flood. And I'm barely squeezing the bag. Like, I don't know if you can see my hands there, just slightly squeezing the bag, very, very minimal movement. And that's because this is my flood. The icing is already seeping out of my bag, so I'm doing it very carefully. And always do a little bit smaller than you want to go. So notice how as soon as the icing kind of settles in, it spreads out a little bit. So I just want to touch a little bit just to get like a little bulb of icing out. Touch it just to the surface of the green, and the icing will do the rest of the work for you. So I just did some yellow centers here, and I'm going to add 5 dots on the outside just to make some flowers. And notice again like how the icing is spreading on the first few that I've done. So that's why we just need a little dollop of icing, not too heavy, very, very light pressure. And sometimes, like my purple one here, the hole is a little bit bigger than my pink icing was, so I have to be very careful and kind of work fast as the icing is already seeping out of my bag by the time I flip it upside down. So it's all about working with your icings. My flood is not all the same, like my green and my pink and my yellow. They're all flood consistencies, but they're not all necessarily the exact same because I don't really measure the water or the icing, and it's really hard to get them perfect. And so you kind of play around with your bag and see, you might cut a hole a little bit slightly bigger than another one. So if your icing is seeping faster, you use less pressure. You go a little bit gentler. If you have a smaller hole or it's a little bit thicker icing, you might have to put some more pressure. But all in all, there's our design, and I love it. I think it's so cute. So moving on to our second shape, we've got our flower here. Now both the bunny head that I just did and this flower are from the Wilton box of 101 cutters. Just cutters that I have on hand that I like to make work. If you don't have these certain shapes, you can use others, or you can always do them on circle cookies, square cookies, whatever you'd like. And here I'm just going to outline some petals in my purple icing. This is my outline consistency. Now a lot of people talk about, one consistency versus 2. It doesn't really matter what you do as long as it works well for you. For me, I have a hard time keeping the icing on my cookie if I do not outline it. So this is my preference, to do an outline and then have my flood. Therefore, if my flood is a little bit too loose, it's not falling off my cookie, it doesn't have to be so perfect. When you're dealing with one consistency, for me, it was really hard to get right to the edges without my icing kind of slopping over. Even with an outline, it happens to me. So, nothing's perfect, but we try our best, and don't be too hard on yourself if you're still not outlining to the edges. If you can't get that consistency quite right, my outline consistency is usually like a soft, thick icing. So it's still a little bit wet looking because when it's really dry, it has a hard time sticking to the cookie, but it holds its shape. It's not running freely if you would pipe flood icing on your cookie. And so with the same consistency, this is my outline still, my thick icing. I'm just going to do some squigglies in the petal, and this will just give a little base to the flood and make sure that it doesn't cave in on itself or give us little craters. So a lot of people ask me, why do you put it in certain areas and not in others? And it's really you know, if I think it might crater, I'd rather just put a quick squiggle. It doesn't take much time. And, you know, rather than waiting for the cookie to dry and seeing this big divot in it or kind of a hole sometimes. So if you sort of have a narrowish space or a smaller space, always a good idea to put a little bit of a thicker squiggle in it and then flood on top. And I also don't wait for that squiggle to dry. I will flood my icing right on top of it. If I wait for it to dry, sometimes I've hit it with my scribe or I hit it with my piping bag while I'm flooding, and then I have chunks of dry icing kind of floating around in my flood. So for me, it works best like this if I don't let it dry. And you can see it kind of supports the icing nicely. And once it dries, it'll look the same. We won't really have any craters. So that's the goal here with the little squiggly lines. So once I set this aside to dry, I'm going to go ahead and pipe my yellow. Now I was talking about my outline consistency that I like a little bit of a softer consistency, still a little bit wet. And the reason is it also works great for detail. So something like this where it's like a circle, I'm just going to pipe a rough guideline and then I'm going to just fill it in with the exact same icing, my outline consistency. And this way I'm able to move the circle out if I need to and kind of fix it and make it more rounder if I'd like to, if some parts are not okay. And then I can quickly and easily smooth it out with my scribe. And I don't have to worry about it sinking in because usually my thicker icing doesn't. So that's the reason I'm using my outline for this kind of smaller, minor detail. And that completes our flower. Okay, next up we have our Easter egg, and I really like this one. So I'm not usually a good color chooser, I guess you could say, for icing. Like I love people that have like such a good eye for what colors go together, but I think it did pretty good on the set. So I really like this yellow that I chose. I'll list all the colors that I used down below in the description of the video. And it just kind of reminds me so much of Easter and spring and those soft colors, and they just go so well. So I'm really proud of that because usually I don't get it so right. So here again, I've got my Easter egg shape here, and I'm just outlining it with my outline consistency and then going in with my flood. Normally I wait for my outlines to dry. This way it really holds its shape, and then I go in with my bag. Notice I take my time around the outline. I kind of flood as much as I can closest to the outline and almost cover the outline. And then when I get into the middle, I can go a little bit quicker. Here I'm working a little bit faster, only because I'm going to do another wet on wet design, and I'm going to put a lot of wet on wet here. So I want to work kind of fast so that my icing doesn't start to dry too quickly, so that I can get all my designs on there before my icing starts to dry. So again, while this is still wet, we just finished flooding the yellow. I'm going to go right in there with my blue icing here. And again, this is my flood consistency. Now, again, if you've already put kind of a too big of a hole in your bag, you might have to, think about these designs, how you're going to do them, and maybe either cut a smaller hole and take a little bit more time to flood, or do these kind of details before you start flooding with these colors that you need a bigger hole for, because you want to have control. So I've just piped 3 lines here, 2 in blue and 1 in purple, and I'm just swiping my scribe through. If you don't have a scribe, a toothpick works perfectly fine as well. And just in between each swipe, I'm wiping off my scribe just to get the excess icing off. And just like that, up, down, and you get this amazing design. And I love how the colors pop on the yellow. And again, it's all about control. And, if your icing's too loose and your hole's too big, your icing is just going to start coming out like crazy out of your bag once you flip it upside down to start piping. So again, just think about those things as you're doing it. If your icing is just not cooperating and it's too loose, then you can always thicken it up and add a little powdered sugar, or you could just rebag it and cut a smaller hole. So here I'm just adding some dots, some pink and green. And again, you can see that some of my dots are coming smaller, and then as the time goes by, it kind of spreads a little bit. So again, just easy on the wet on wet. And I don't want to put too much icing on top either, because it's going to spread the yellow icing that I already have down. My purple one is kind of my loosest icing, so I'm working fast with that one. And basically, just like piping straight lines, I touch down, lift up a little bit, and touch down with these lines. And again, we're going to do the swiping technique, so up and down, and wiping my scribe in between each one. And you can see it's taking a little bit longer as we're going for each kind of swipe to settle than, let's say, the first section I did, just because the icing is, it's been on the cookie for a little bit now, so it's just beginning the crusting over phases, not quite, but this is telling me, okay, if I have any other designs I want to do, I better go quick. And even the pink icing, it'll take a few seconds longer now to settle, but eventually it does, and you can always give your cookie a few taps just to settle everything in, but it does settle over time, so I think it came out great. What do you guys think? And last but not least, we have our tulip cookie. And again, this is a Wilton cutter that I have on hand that I've used before, and I really like it. It's a simple cutter, but it's really cute, really fun to decorate. So what we're gonna do is outline the edge, and notice that I did kind of a diagonal across. So this will be like our outer petal. And then I'll outline the rest of the petals as well. So again, from the middle up to the corner, I'm doing this section. So that'll be our second petal, kind of on the other side of the tulip. And every time that I go, and there I just broke the line. It happens sometimes. Again, sometimes when the icing is a little bit drier, it doesn't stick as well to the cookie, but that's okay. We just scrape away and repipe. Totally fine, will not be noticeable when we go ahead and flood. So don't even worry if you have things mishaps like this. It's really minor, happens all the time, no big deal. Once my outline has dried, I can go in again with my flood. We're gonna do one section at a time, and we're gonna make sure the section has crusted over, dried a little bit before we move on to the next. The reason being is I want a nice separation between the sections. And if I were to flood everything right now, the flood would kind of go over the outline and just melt together, and you wouldn't really see any definition. So we're going to flood this big section first. And if all the other sections are touching this big section, then I'll have to just wait and do one at a time. If there was another section that was separate that isn't touching, then we could do it right away. But at this point, everything's going to be touching. So we have to wait a little bit and let it crust over. So now my bottom section is dry. So if I push my finger in it right now, it would still go through and crack the icing, but it's dry enough where if I pipe next to it, it's not going to melt together. So don't worry if you can't get in those corners, we can get those with the scribe later. But anytime you're going kind of a seam next to another section of icing, just go really slow and careful. You don't want to over pipe that section. And any small corners, I just kind of drag the icing very, very lightly with the tip of my scribe just to get it all the way to the corner. I almost pull the icing over that section, like past that section, and it works really well. Here again, we're using our little trick of putting outline consistency down first as a squiggle. This just helps that area from cratering. And I'm just going really slow, very little pressure. It's a small area, just so I can have control of my bag. I'm not going to overfill it too much. I can't get right in there because my tip is a little bit too big. So no problem. I'm going to go in there with my scribe and just kind of push the icing very gently all the way into those corners. And last but not least, we got to do our stem. So here I've got my outline consistency in green. This is a tiny, tiny area. So I'm just going to fill it all up with my outline consistency and smooth it out. If I were to do a large area like this, I'd have to flood it. But because it's so small, it's super easy to fill in with my outline and smooth it right away. And it's a beautiful tulip cookie. I hope you guys like this set. Make sure you stay tuned for more. As always, thank you so much for watching and happy baking.